Good afternoon, everyone. We are now going to begin our afternoon plenary session, and we have a real treat. With all the talk about shifting funds and focusing on defense rather than development, we thought it timely to bring together some experts to really talk about this topic for us. Our next plenary panel is called Development and Defense, the Role of Development in an Increasingly Unstable World. Many of you attended the panel earlier today about isolationism and nationalism, which touched on this issue. Why pay for development when we need to think of our own national security? How are these issues related? Does one affect the other? Are there distinctions between soft power and hard power anymore? Years ago, defense, development, and diplomacy was defined to me as boots, sandals, and wingtips. The military had the boots, the development community had the sandals, and the diplomats had their wingtips. And each played their own role in a very set sequence in the development process. That doesn't appear to be happening quite the same anymore. Over the past few years, a dialogue has begun between the State Department, between USAID, and defense. It's very clear that this is happening. And I wanted to give you just a couple of examples of what's going on. Earlier this morning, I mentioned that members of the United States Naval Academy's international program are attending today's conference. Over the past 10 years, the Naval Academy has developed a spectacular program that allows midshipmen to take courses in international development, as well as study abroad programs that include a community service component to allow them to immerse themselves in the language and in understanding the culture. This is all done before they become officers, which then, having a great knowledge of culture, foreign affairs, foreign assistance, which gives them a perspective that they wouldn't otherwise have as they become officers within the Navy and work abroad. We also have people such as Admiral Stavridis, who is recently the retired Supreme Allied Commander of the U.S. NATO forces, and is now the Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Even while he was an admiral, he was a strong proponent of the use of soft and hard power. But since becoming the dean at Fletcher, he's become a major advocate in the discussions of soft and hard power and trying to bridge the dialogue between defense and diplomacy. By the way, SID on November 30th is going to honor Dean Stavridis by awarding him the SID Leadership Award. This will be the first time we've ever recognized somebody formally from the military, and please mark it on your calendar because it'll be a very interesting discussion that day. I'm sure everyone here is also familiar with the familiar statement of Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, while commander of the U.S. Central Command, he said, "If you don't fully fund the State Department, you'll need to buy me more ammunition." So it's very clear that the discussion has started. Where it's going is what we might find out today from our plenary panel. My fellow board member, Sue Chodakewitz, who's also the president of Nathan Associates, will moderate the discussion. And Sue is the perfect moderator for this talk, as she has a strong background in both defense and development. In addition to her service with Nathan Associates, she was president of Tetra Tech AMT and also spent more than a decade at SAIC, a major defense and national security contractor, where she ultimately became the senior vice president. Sue has also worked at Booz Allen, the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and has gathered today an exceptional panel of major people representing defense, development, and from a range of sectors and think tanks. So please welcome me in welcoming Sue and her panel.
Thank you, Byron, for that great introduction. Anyone who introduces me always has the biggest challenge of pronouncing my last name. So thank you for working on that so well. I know this is the last panel of the day, and we are between you and the glass of wine. But there is no question in my mind that this panel is going to make delaying that wine more than worthwhile. So before I introduce the panelists, I want to just take a moment or two to frame the discussion going forward for this panel. Certainly, Byron touched upon some of these key elements, but let me reiterate some of them as a way to kick off the discussion. So, at the risk of stating the obvious, there has been much discussion recently about the role of diplomacy and development in this White House. But the reality, as we know, is that there are much larger and more numerous trends and influencing factors at play that transcend one administration. There appears to be a shift in the paradigm that is driving the narrative of the respective and relative roles of development, diplomacy, and defense in the national security context. Now, clearly, you can look at this from various vantage points. You could look at different drivers, right? Is it hard versus soft versus smart power? Is it operational effectiveness? Is it budgetary constraints and trade-offs? Or the changing nature of warfare? Or a new national security continuum wherein diplomacy and development are simply tools in the collective quiver? Regardless of your perspective, it's becoming increasingly clear that the framework for looking at development is fundamentally changing. So one key question then is, what does this all mean for professionals and practitioners who live in any part of this continuum? And furthermore, for the people in the room who specialize in providing development assistance and support, what will it mean going forward in terms of budgets, priorities, and organizational structures? As resources shift, what will that mean for delivery of development assistance itself? How will the myriad of stakeholders not just coordinate, but come together for a shared vision? And where is the center of gravity going to be of diplomacy, development, and national security in the future? Fortunately, we have the answers because of the esteemed panel members we have today, whose individual and collective experience position them just as the right group of people to address these questions and others. So before I introduce them, let me very quickly make a couple of comments about the way this panel is going to work, okay? Each panel member is going to give just a couple of minutes of opening remarks, and I'll introduce them briefly before they do so. We're then going to take about 10 minutes and ask that the panel members pull some threads and talk about some of the issues that have been tabled as a result of their comments. We'll then have some moderated questions, and then ultimately we're going to save about 20 minutes for Q&A from all of you. So get your pens and pads ready and start writing those down. So we're going to go in order of our guests sitting here today. So it is absolutely my pleasure to introduce Michèle Flournoy. Michèle served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from 2009 to 2012. In this capacity, she was the principal advisor to the SecDef in the formulation of national security and defense policy, oversight of military plans and operations, and in NSC deliberations. In 2007, Ms. Flournoy co-founded and served as the president of the Center for New American Security, a nonpartisan think tank dedicated to developing strong, pragmatic, and principled national security policies. And currently, she serves on various boards, including the Defense Policy Board and the Council of Foreign Relations. Michèle, thank you so much for being with us today. Over to you.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction. I also serve on the Board of CARE, and so I have a little bit of a window into the world of development through that, that affiliation. But I just want to say I can't imagine a more critical time for this audience, this group to be meeting. Both a time of opportunity in terms of tremendous progress in the reduction of extreme poverty around the world, but also a time of tremendous challenge in terms of both what's happening on the ground, civil wars that have produced the most substantial refugee crisis since World War II, as well as teetering on the brink of at least 4 famines that I can count around the world. So this is an incredibly challenging time just in the environment that we're trying to deal with. But we also have a new challenge to us, and that is an administration that's come in proposing draconian cuts to U.S. development assistance. And not only development assistance, food aid, humanitarian response, really across the board, that if implemented would take the U.S. down towards the bottom of the list of OECD countries in terms of the percentage contribution of our GDP. Today, U.S. development assistance is less than a penny on the dollar. And what I would argue to you is that that investment is very much in U.S. interest. So even if you have a realpolitik perspective and you're saying what's in it for the U.S., this is a worthy investment. Of course, it's good in its own right, and it's important in its own right, but it's also good from a U.S. foreign policy perspective. First, what we do in development around the world has a substantial impact in terms of our influence and our leadership, our ability to pull together coalitions to solve shared problems. It builds, it creates stature, it puts money in the influence bank for us, if you will. And it also, it's a set of actions that really communicates who we are. Yes, we are the world's leading power, but we're also a force for good. We are a power that's historically lived our values and sought to be a force for good in the world, and development assistance is a great way to show that. That said, I would also argue, as someone who spent a lot of time in the Defense Department trying to help the Secretary make decisions on conflicts like Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya, the war on terror. Development also does have a role to play, a critical role to play in national security in some contexts. It can be a critical element of preventing conflict in some situations. Think about Yemen. Think about the fundamental causes of what's led to the crisis in Yemen. Arguably, there are ways that we might have done a much better job at preventing that crisis. Think about the efforts we're making to build resilience in communities in terms of dealing with climate change. If those efforts fail, those areas will become much more likely sources of conflict in the future. It also is very important on the back end when you're trying to bring a country out of conflict and stabilize the situation. We're about to see this play out in Mosul and Raqqa. If there is success in clearing ISIS out of those areas, how are we going to stabilize those communities? Some sort of development investment in those areas will be absolutely critical to that end. So I would just say this is a really critical conversation. I think there's a diversity of views on the panel, so I'm looking forward to hearing from my colleagues. But I would also urge the audience this is a time to get motivated and take action, and particularly on the Hill, and to say, look, the administration's proposal is so far off, it's unacceptable. It's not in our national security interests. Let's start with the last year's appropriation as the baseline and go from there. Embrace reform, embrace innovation, but let's not make sort of wrecking ball kind of cuts to development assistance in the name of reform.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Let me introduce now Dr. Gordon Adams, who is a professor emeritus at American University's School of International Service and a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center. He served for 5 years, from 1993 to 97, although I think that's 4, as the senior White House budget official for national security and foreign policy. That was like a trick, right? As the White House budget official for national security and foreign policy in his capacity as associate director at OMB. He is also the co-editor and major author of Mission Creep, the Militarization of U.S. Foreign Policy. Perfect segue for our discussion today. Thanks, Gordon.
Thanks very much, Sue. As a budget guy, I have to say, if you start at the beginning of January 93 yes. and you end at the end of December 97, technically.
Then it's 5 years. Yeah. I'm sure I would have heard that from many others as well.
Baselines. It's all about baselines. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Picking up a bit from where Michèle left off, I would argue, even more broadly, we live in an incredibly disruptive moment. The moment we're living in foreign policy, nay, in politics in general in the United States, is about as disruptive as I have ever experienced it. And I was born when Franklin Roosevelt was president. So it's a long time that we've never seen anything quite like this. How you handle it and how you experience it is something I really want to hear about, because I think it is about as unpredictable as anything. As some people know, I have a little bit of side career as a Shakespearean actor, and I'd like to be able to tell you that what's going on right now is much ado about nothing. I'd like to be able to tell you that at the end, all's well that ends well, right? In fact, if some of you might even get your preferences as you like it, you may get what you want. But I suspect we're in a world that will be a comedy of errors, and we're going to have to see how this evolves almost moment for moment, or if you will, measure for measure. Right? End of Shakespeare. But it's not a normal moment. And it makes it the parameters of predictability here have just yawned on us. Where this is going to come out, in fact, where America's role in the world is going to come out as a consequence of where we are right now, is virtually unpredictable. And that range of uncertainty, I think, covers not just the concerns that you have in the foreign assistance, economic assistance community, not just in the community of military affairs and what the Department of Defense does, but even more broadly. If you think you're going through an era of unpredictability, just imagine where people who are concerned about the stability of American democracy are going. Think about where people who are concerned about the future of health care in the United States are going, what they're dealing with. Think about all those industries, people, societies, associations, governments that have a panoply of regulations developed over 70 years that are now being systematically dismantled. Think about the range of uncertainty that represents for them. So there's a legacy, I think, of maybe 70 years in many respects of very bipartisan progress in the United States, both domestically and internationally, that is right now at stake. Nothing less dramatic, I think, than that. And it's certainly true, I think, of our foreign policy and of the role of our foreign policy institutions. The ones you represent are particularly troubled at the moment because both of the effort to reorganize and restructure inside the foreign policy agencies and because of budget proposals that represent probably the most draconian cuts that I have ever seen. People at APA are experiencing the same problem, right? So it's not unusual to the foreign policy world, but it certainly strikes home where we all have lived and worked, everybody on this panel and many of you, for many, many years. If you can predict for me where this budget is going to come out, you know, I will give you some kind of meritorious award, because I don't think anybody knows at this point. My projection would be that a 28% cut in Function 150, the international affairs part of the budget, will not happen. But I cannot tell you that it will be straight-lined. I think that's unlikely. The range of uncertainty is on the downside from where we've been. And I say that not only because I have my crystal ball about what's happening with the foreign policy and the defense budget of the United States, but I say it as well because this particular set of budget reductions is not a policy-driven set of budget reductions. It is a mechanical-driven set of budget reductions. The international affairs budget, being perhaps the most weakly defended in the federal budget overall, faces a particular problem from OMB and the White House in this administration, which was we need to plus up defense by a large number over the baseline in the caps. We need to look like we've paid for it. We will do that on the domestic side of the budget. And oh, by the way, in the least well-defended set of categories, State Department, AID, and the foreign policy agencies, we will take a big mechanical whack. Not programmatically driven, not policy-driven, strictly numerical. Now, as Michèle said, the game will be up in the Congress. When it comes to the Congress is going to be playing with a bigger billiard table. It's not just defense versus foreign policy money. It is defense versus all domestic discretionary money, which is part of where international money sits budgetarily. So my guess, and we can talk more about that later if you want, is this will probably not be an era of increase. It will be an era of decrease in foreign affairs funding. It will probably not be minus 28%, but we're going to count ourselves lucky if it's minus 10. And overall domestic spending in which these funds sit will probably go up more than proposed in the budget, but less than what you might expect, and defense will go up much more than what you would expect from the caps, but not all the way to where the president's proposed it be. That's my sense budgetarily. I think we will also see, and we'll talk about this, a rather dramatic acceleration in the trend towards the militarization of foreign policy, by which I mean the predominant tool for exercising American engagement will be the military. And we can talk about what that means, but I think we've seen it in support for the Saudis in Yemen, we've seen it in Syria, we're going to see it in other countries around the world. And the last thing I want to say is that this shift in the way the administration has oriented American engagement is part of a much broader assault on a tradition of multilateralism and leadership in American foreign policy. I believe, and again, something to talk about, it picks up on a rather broad evolution that's happened since the end of the Cold War in the redistribution of international power. And that's going to affect the context within which all of you talk about the programs and policies and efforts that you undertake so well. I think we're going to see the end of two things that we're very used to talking about: the necessity of American leadership and American exceptionalism. Those things I think were already underway in an evolutionary sense. We can go back into where and how, but I think they are being accelerated, not just by today's announcement on the climate change agreement, from Paris Agreement, but also on the Trans-Pacific Partnership and a whole series of decisions, including the NATO visit, all of which point to a direction away from both leadership and exceptionalism. That's going to affect how you all do your business. And last thing I'll say, that will, I think, inevitably have institutional consequences. What they will be, I don't know, and I look forward to talking amongst us and in Q&A as to what some of the options are that happen literally to the agencies that you're used to dealing with, as a consequence both of that power shift and the change in the resource balance inside the United States government. So it's a very big moment, I think, in American government and in American engagement. We're just seeing the beginning of it.
Thank you, Gordon. Let me introduce next Sharon Burke. Sharon is a senior advisor at New America, where she runs the Resource Security Program, which examines the intersection of natural resources and national security and the root of insecurity. Previously, Ms. Burke served in the Obama administration as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Operational Energy, a new office at the time that worked to improve the energy security of U.S. military operations. She also served on the State Department's policy planning staff in the Bush administration. Ms. Burke is an advisor to Oak Ridge National Lab and the World Economics Forum, among others. So thank you for being here today, Sharon.
Thank you, Sue. I just want to start off by making an observation that you should know what you heard from Michèle Flournoy, who's a very respected leader in the defense community. Her most recent position in government was in the Obama administration, but she's respected by the uniformed military, by both parties. I think this administration tried to recruit her. So that tells you. So what she told you about how she sees development is not just because she's here and you're here. That's what she really believes, and it's not an uncommon view in the defense community and with uniformed military. So I wanted to start that way and then sort of upend the conversation. I would guess that a lot of you have been having conversations today about how you can move closer to defense, or how you can militarize, or how you reposition what you do in the era that we're in, particularly with the budget situation. I want to switch it around and say that you're not the only ones having this conversation. Think about the Department of Defense. So for the last 15 years that we've been at war, we've been in what the military calls distributed and irregular operations. Distributed meaning that we're not behind our own front line, and irregular meaning it's not tanks facing tanks and pure countries fighting on a field of battle. There's no front line, and we are talking about ambushes and improvised explosive devices. This is a different kind of warfare. It's by no means unknown in the United States. That's how we became an independent nation, because George Washington was good at it. But it's not what we're optimized for right now as a military. A lot of our major investments are locked into what we would call platforms, big platforms. The Joint Strike Fighter, which is the next generation combat fighter. The Littoral Combat Ship, which is a big, expensive, very fast ship, or at least it's supposed to be very fast. Nuclear submarines. These things all matter, and that kind of defense, I believe, will still be a part of our country and protecting our nation from traditional threats. But those big platforms that are taking up a lot of our defense dollars are not much help for the kinds of fights that we've been in, that we are in right now. So we're a country that is optimized for warfighting and for a certain kind of warfighting and not for building security. That's not what our Defense Department does, and that is a well-recognized issue in the defense establishment. And you'll hear lots of different terms like asymmetric warfare, fourth-generation warfare, gray zone warfare, as the department tries to struggle with how we achieve security for this country when our traditional instruments, for military instruments, are not working to build security. Obviously I work on natural resources and how those are part of the equation. And so my mind is very much on climate change today, which is no surprise. But it's also a good example, a good case in point for me for how I look at this. I see climate change as a security issue, but not every security issue has a military solution. I think in a place like Somalia, which the last couple of days I've been engaged in a couple of events on Somalia, so I've been thinking a lot about it. It's very much a security situation. It's a civil war, of course, warring factions, but also you've got militant groups, and Al-Shabaab is one of the worst. And that's a military problem with a military solution. But you're not going to secure Somalia if you stop there. Right now, Somalia is on the brink of a disastrous famine. About 6 million people are at risk in a country of 12 million people at imminent risk. And that's not going to be solved by special operations forces. But how do we do this? And as a country, we're not well positioned to bring all these things together as a set of wicked problems that are interlinked, which is this is about the way that their climate is changing. This is about the way they manage their resources. This is about a civil war that's ongoing and an insecure population. This is about people moving and pastoralists and farmers and merchants coming into conflict, people who are insecure and threatened, who don't have a lot of choices and are making the best choices they can, a government that's not sufficient, is corrupt to the extent that it exists. It's all of that together, and they're not separable challenges. But we, again, don't have a robust way of addressing them all together. So the way I look at it is not that development needs to become more defense, but that defense needs to have, we need to define security differently as not just a military problem with a military solution. And I think that right now, we don't have the institutions of government to do that well. I'm not optimistic in this administration that that's going to change, obviously, but the work continues, and a lot of the balance of that will continue to be in the non-governmental sector, in the international sector, and that's the work that all of you do. So what I really wanted to say is that I think you have allies in the Department of Defense, if you don't already know that, who are trying to figure out how they have a more effective national security apparatus in the times that we're in. And no matter what the rest of the administration looks like, that's going to continue to be true. And of course, the irony of that Mattis quote is that, he said, if you're going to not fund the State Department, you better give me more ammunition, and they're giving him more ammunition. Mm-hmm. But how he's going to handle that and what kinds of investments he's going to make remains to be seen. And that's the case that I think all of you have to make, and you have a willing audience in him and in the Department of Defense.
Thank you so much for that. Let me now, last but not least, introduce Ambassador Sarah Mendelson. Ambassador Mendelson served as the U.S. representative to the Economic and Social Council at the United Nations until January 2017. With her 2015 Senate confirmation, she was the US-UN lead on international development, human rights, and humanitarian affairs. She also served as Deputy Assistant Administrator at USAID for 4 years, where she was the agency lead on democracy, human rights, and governance. Dr. Mendelson has spent over 20 years working on development and human rights at the Fletcher School, at CSIS, and at other very, very well-regarded institutions. So thank you for being here, and over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. It's great to be back in this room. We had many fond town halls at AID. It's actually the first time in 3 years that I've been in the building, so it feels really great. I want to draw on some reflections that I have from New York and have a conversation that's not just about Washington today, and then I'll return to where we are today. There is an enormously ambitious and optimistic agenda that we all, 193 member states, agreed to in September 2015. Of course, I'm talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs they hold an opportunity to build a world that is more prosperous, secure, one that supports equality for all of us, even the most disadvantaged. It's an agenda that is breathtaking in its ambition. And it's one that I don't hear very much about in Washington today, but I'm here to tell you that my colleagues from around the world, many of whom their both domestic and international agencies are moving smartly out on this agenda. The brilliance of the SDGs is that they're universal. They apply to us as well. And I think there's a lot in the SDGs that could help us heal what are a lot of inequalities and ruptures in this society. And by doing that, we would actually be better development partners around the world. So this would be a shift from a world in which we're global North donors to global South, so that we're also affecting what happens at home. I think it holds the possibility of reducing what I think of as tribalism, even inside USAID, where the development experts are here, the humanitarians are there, the democracy, human rights, and governance folks are over there. And that's not how people live. If you're asking a family in Turkey that has fled Syria whether or not they want to wait 3 years to educate their children, they're not going to say, yes, we'd like to wait 3 years to educate our children. But yet, that's how we were organized in the humanitarian assistance sector. We didn't have anybody with an education background in OFTA or in OTI working on the ground. So there is the possibility of putting people at the center of our development response, using much more data and being much more effective. There's also, I think, an amazing shift with the SDGs that recognizes the role of rights and governance as fundamental in development. And this gets us very much away from a more technocratic perspective. But it also, I think, holds the promise of answering some of these security questions by recognizing that we have enormous governance gaps in so many parts of the world. It's going to elevate our focus on that. But it also reflects an organic movement around the world that is fueled in part by our iPhones and other innovations and technologies. And that is a movement for more openness, transparency, and accountability. It's what fueled the Euromaidan in Ukraine, but we see it in Kenya, we see it in Indonesia, we see it in Brazil. And of course, and this is where I'm going to be coming back to the Washington conversation, it's also fueled a backlash in many parts of the world, where authoritarians are very nervous about the increased power of individuals to hold governments accountable. So we're going to be in this really push you, pull me mode for a while, where the forces of open are in a lot of ways really struggling with the forces for closed. That affects the work that all of us do, where countries are putting in places laws that make it more difficult for foreign assistance and NGOs to govern. And the impact on civil society, both international and domestic, is profound, and it's something that we need to be focused on. We were fortunate to get President Obama out several times discussing it. But truly speaking, we probably need a new business model that makes sure that NGOs on the ground are even more listening and responding to local populations rather than donors back home. Obviously, the SDGs are very early days. You hear nothing about them in Washington. It's not clear to me that we have a workforce that is aligned to actually implement them. It's not clear to me that we have, in universities and graduate programs, students who are tomorrow's workforce in AID or DFID or wherever, that they know how to work on this. So those are huge challenges. And obviously, we have a White House that, in the National Security Council, has done away with development experts, democracy experts, human rights experts. In the NSC chart that the Washington Post published the other day, there's no DevDem, there's multi-lat, but the human rights piece is taken away. I'm not so concerned about where it sits, but the fact that it's not at the table at all is deeply problematic, and it is a reflection of the fact that we seem to have some in the White House who clearly don't understand the full toolkit that is available for US foreign policy that absolutely includes diplomacy and obviously development. I don't think the budget was a serious one. I don't think cutting FuseNet at a moment when you have this number of famines is a serious, it's not the work of a serious OMB, frankly. I have great faith in the appropriators on the Hill. There are many accounts that the appropriators themselves wrote in, and they're not going to see them deleted or erased. But it is a moment where I think we need to continue to make the argument to Americans why this is important. Americans are very generous people, and they intrinsically, I think, understand the importance of engaging. We're not going to get everybody, as I was observing in the panel before, but I think that there are a lot of people who are going to get this. I think there are mayors and governors who are going to understand, if you unpack the 17 goals of the SDGs, that they'll understand it makes a difference for their city or their rural community, and it's going to be a way for them to get ahead as well and connect on the international front. So I'll stop there, and we can have a conversation.
Great. Thank you all so much for your incredible comments and thoughts. What I'd like to do is keep this fairly loose for a few minutes and just have you all pull some threads and ask some follow-up questions and use your comments as points of departure for each other. So no shortage of topics to address. We could clearly be here all day. But let me see, Michèle, if you would like to maybe kick this off.
Sure. I mean, I guess one of the things I would emphasize is there's always been a problem in the way that we fund the different tools of our foreign policy. If you think of diplomacy, development, and defense as a three-legged stool, it's really not a stool. You have one very large leg and two very short ones. And just to bring this kind of into perspective, I think it is one of the reasons why Sharon's point is so valid, which is the US military, they want a more robust development set of partners. They want a more robust set of diplomatic partners because they've found themselves in situations with Americans in harm's way where they can take the ball down the field only so far. And then other tools are required to negotiate a political settlement, to help advise a new government, to create sources of livelihood for the population, to address a humanitarian issue. And it's really outside their purview, their skill set, what they're trained, prepared to do, and yet they cannot complete their mission without those. A very concrete example. At a point where we were still contemplating a follow-on presence in Iraq, we had brought together the interagency. We were very proud of this. We did a very integrated plan that was sort of anchored in the State Department footprint of an embassy and a number of consulates, the AID mission on offices on top of that, the intelligence piece on top of that, and then the military was sort of laid on top in terms of both force protection, where training sites would be, and so forth. And we sent it up to the Hill for early consideration. And of course, this beautifully integrated plan got chopped into all of the little pieces, and the defense piece went through the defense committees, and the others went through the foreign affairs committee. And it comes back, and lo and behold, the DoD piece is 110% funded. The intelligence piece is 95% funded. The State Department piece is under 50% funded. And so the whole thing collapses, and you have to start over. Instead of having 6 sites, now you have one embassy and 2 consulates. And so the integration the lack of integration, because of the lack of balanced resources. I mean, we're never going to have the State Department and AID funded to the level of the Defense Department, and that's not what I'm saying. But funded proportionally to actually be able to achieve shared missions and objectives for the country, that is important. And the politics of the color of money get in the way of reaching that ability to integrate and have a balanced approach. And so I think one of the things I'd be very interested in, Gordon's thought on this, is how can we get that integration? Do we need a standing committee on national security to be able to look at this? Do we need to start thinking about budgets not by agency or executors, but by mission set, and look at cross-cutting? I mean, DoD has tried to transfer money to state. We've tried to pool authorities and resources where state has 90% of the authorities and DoD puts in 90% of the money. I mean, we have tried everything, and the opposition to this is fierce, particularly not only, I think, within this administration, but historically on the Hill. So I'd love to get other people's thoughts on how can we get to more balanced resourcing, because until you get to that, you can't get to the integration that you need on the ground.
And I'm curious, Michèle, I think it's also flies in the face of the way security is right now, which, again, from a military point of view, it used to be pretty sequential, right? You fought the war, you recovered from the war, you rebuilt, you built the peace. But these things are all collapsed now and happening at the same time.
Right.
And you're having to fight while you're having to rebuild. But again, our ability to structure that way isn't very good. And I think the will is there, but the way is the problem. Do you think, is that sequencing issue, would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I agree with it. The idea of the traditional phases of warfare have been overtaken by events. And a different.
I want to throw something out to
the
you,
enemy
Gordon.
gets a vote.
I know you've already got one question. Here's the second one for you, and I think for you too.
Yeah.
Which is, I know that your book, you're really influential on this and about the militarization of foreign policy, and that's not a good thing, including for the reasons Michèle just said, which is it's really hard to train to fight a war and to train people to do that within boundaries, and asking them to do other things that they're not trained for. Right. It's not good for that thing, and it's not good for what they're supposed to be able to do. On the other hand, this is who we are. This is our country. Our country will support a $700 billion a year defense budget. We have 2 million people serving in the active duty reserves and Guard. We have 19 million veterans. We have bases all over the country. There's a constituency. It's one of the most trusted institutions in the country for many years. This is just the fact of life. Instead of saying, we've got to stop militarizing foreign policy, should we lean into it and say that we need to change the mission and use the fact that this is the trusted institution and make sure that we do have a piece of it that's ready? I could go either way on that, but I'm curious what you think.
Let me try to start with where
and
Michèle
I apologize
was.
for coughing in your all's ears. My office has just had this ripping through, and I promise I'm not contagious anymore.
And I'm sitting next to it.
I won't kiss you,
Great.
depending on what you say.
I don't know whether it's good news or bad news.
We'll talk later.
Okay. We'll negotiate on that.
Yeah.
Let's make a deal. Can we make a deal? All right. Here's the boundaries of uncertainty on this. I want to come back to your question. The boundaries of uncertainty of this right now are enormous. It is not clear to me that we're not so far having a conversation that is a very interesting piece of history, but not the future. I don't think we know now whether the United States is actually going to engage in another Iraq or Afghanistan type of exercise. Neither of those went particularly well. There's some negative lessons learned, right? But I don't think we know that we're going to do that. I can't tell you we're not going to, but I can no longer tell you that the most operationally or budgetarily significant problem we face is how to mesh the instruments of statecraft. I'd like to think it was, but I'm not sure it is in this atmosphere. And what I said earlier about the nature of the international environment into which we're heading is we may not be asked to. We may well not be the most favorite son of the planet, the leader, the integrator, the exceptional nation, the person who puts these tools together and does this thing. I no longer have a secure answer in my own mind to whether that is an operational requirement. I understand at the ground level and the data level of a lot of the work that you do in the field, that question comes up, right? But the history, as demonstrated at the very least by the CGAR and CGAR reports on both Iraq and Afghanistan, is we ain't done it very well. And we continue, frankly, not to do it very well. The situation in Afghanistan is a wonderful exemplar of not only do we not do it well, but how hard it is to do. And it may not be a do-out that we can do, or that any other country can do in somebody else's country. Right, so that's a baseline kind of issue for me. Is this something that we are actually going to do? Right? Which brings me to the problem that you raise, right? Which is full to 10. The Department of Defense is the only institution capable of raising $600 to $700 billion a year. That's where the money is. Follow the money. Let's hive some of this responsibility over to the Defense Department. Here's the problem, and this is something that I did write about in the book. The problem is, as we have seen demonstrated, it is not a natural act for the military to assume a wider range of operational responsibilities than the field responsibilities that they train for, fight for, know how to do, and do damn well. Right? It is not a natural extension of military capacity to say, you will be the economic developer, you will be the social integrator, you will be the well digger, you will be the school builder, you will be the counselor to governments, because that's where the money is. Right? That's not the primary mission of a soldier. It's not the primary mission of a military person. It's not a mission to which they're trained. And a lot of soldiers will tell you, if I'm spending all of my time doing that, I'm eroding my skills as a soldier. I got a job. I got a mission. I got something I do well. Right? And that means that simply caving to put these responsibilities in the Defense Department is going to get them done. The reality is, in our experience at least, that they don't do them especially well because they're not natural skill sets. In addition to which, by assuming time after time that it is in the Department of Defense that the money and capabilities reside, we further contribute to the erosion of the capabilities of the civilian instruments of statecraft, the diplomats and the developers. We erode the expectation that those institutions can do those jobs. We erode the capability to raise resources for those institutions to do those jobs. We are adding to the problem. We are, in a sense, in my judgment, shooting ourselves in the foot budgetarily and institutionally by moving in that direction. And the third problem that we have, and I think it's an underlying problem here, is love or hate uniforms. It puts a military uniform on the face of America's global engagement. And without any judgment as to effectiveness or lovability, in another country, in another era, in another solution, in another culture, that is not necessarily the best face for American statecraft. overseas, right? So that, I mean, that's the judgment I rendered too in the book, but that's my view on why this is a very controversial and potentially self-defeating decision. I can't change the reality, Sharon, that you underlined, which is that's the way, and Sharon and Michèle's quite right, that's the way our budget politics work. It is the way the budget politics work, and I don't have an easy answer to how to change the way those budget politics work. But creating institutional settings where we further reinforce the bias that the primary instrument of engagement is the military because that's where the money is, contributes to these other difficult outcomes for me.
Great. Thank you. Let me hand this over to Sarah before we open things up a little bit.
I know there are tons of people who want to get engaged on this, having served overseas, obviously, with the military. Everybody's had experience. I just want to say there is an alternative budget scenario that is running around Washington that Senator Chris Murphy has put forward, which actually does make the argument that for security reasons, you want to have a USAID and a State Department well-funded. Funded, maybe not at the same levels of DoD, but much more funded. That is ultimately a much more balanced approach to our national security. It's an opening gambit, but it's an important time for him to make the argument. And I want to come out in favor of discipline. Development is a discipline. And the Defense Department is not a development agency. To ask the Defense Department to become a development agency will erode our tools and our expertise as development professionals. And it won't do good work on the ground. And I don't even think it's something that the Defense Department wants. So in many places, uniformed service members are working very well with AID. In Dacha, we had uniformed service members deployed inside the bureaus to make sure that there's good communication between the COCOMs and missions around the world. Obviously, I'm sure there could be improvement in many places, but there is a healthy respect, I think, between the Defense Department and AID. I think sometimes there's more challenges between AID and the State Department. That sort of and I worry very much that in the erosion of development expertise, we'll expect our diplomats to be able to do it when they don't have the expertise either. So.
No, that's great. And I think what I'm going to do is use that as a jumping off point to open the floor to Q&A. We've touched upon so many really critical issues, right? Fighting wars, building security, budgets, organizational structures, the role of development and diplomacy in pre and post-conflict. So I'm sure that many of you want to go in many different directions. So if we can see hands or stand with questions and identify yourself, and if you want to direct your question to one individual or the entire panel, please let us know. We're going to try to see hands. Yes, sir.
That was a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much. I'm Steve Mosley with the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area. And I'm wondering, one of the areas you didn't, and I think this panel would be a wonderful panel to at least comment on this, is what vacuum is left and who's going to fill it if the development role, whether it's in concert better with the defense and in diplomacy, but at the rate we're going and whether the budget becomes 28% less or up to 10% less, it's still going to be a larger and larger vacuum in the face of more and more conflict. Where is that going to leave us relative to the other players who would like to fill that vacuum for lack of, certainly lack of development? Could you comment about that? I'm asking you to comment, I guess, about China, two other key players in this. It's an important part of the question.
Thanks.
Yeah, I would say two things. I do think that to the extent U.S. government funding is cut, I know that the major NGOs are scrambling to try to ramp up other sources of funding so that their most critical programs are not disrupted in the event of this change. I think you may see some other countries step into the void, but most particularly, I think you will see, to the extent we pull back from whole areas, I mean, one of the things that's most disturbing to me about the rumored cuts at state AID is beyond the budget cut, is simply removing embassies and AID missions from countries, just leaving lock, stock, and barrel certain countries, or dramatically downgrading our presence, just ending an entire national development program. So that to me is very concerning, and you can count on countries like China, particularly China, if it's in Asia, any part of Asia, if it's in Africa where there are strategic mineral resources at stake, if it's anywhere near the One Belt One Road that they've mapped out, you can imagine China stepping in to take advantage. And I think that's, from a strategic sense, doesn't make any strategic sense for us whatsoever. I was going to push back a little bit on your, we may not need to integrate in the future. That may be in a very tactical, operational sense to be true. But strategically, we do. So if we worry about the rise of a China that maybe become a competitor, if not worse, and we care about a country like India as such a critical strategic partner. Yes, we're going to deepen our bilateral defense cooperation, and we're already doing that. Yes, we're going to ramp up our diplomacy and our partnership. But a key component of that is continuing to invest in India's emergence and their development. They're living a sort of a duality where they are an increasingly important economy and political player, but they are also still struggling with some of the worst poverty on the planet. And so if we just abandon India because, well, they're an emerging, a middle power now, so they don't need a U.S. development assistance, imagine how that's going to undercut our strategic objectives diplomatically and in terms of defense.
Yeah, absolutely. The credibility issue is huge and very far-reaching. Gordon, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I would argue, and maybe India is a good example of this, we do relatively little development assistance in India. We do a lot of population work, but relatively little development assistance in India. I agree with you, Michèle, that the integration that is needed here is at the strategic level. I don't think it's at the budgetary level. I don't think it's at the operational level. Or let me say more carefully, it may not be at the operational or implementation level as important as it may be at the strategic level. Bracket, I see no evidence that this administration has that kind of strategic sense about how to integrate the tools of American statecraft. But I absolutely agree with you at the strategic level. It's something that we haven't done well, don't do well, need to do a lot better. And India's a perfectly good relationship, although I would say arguably I don't think development is the key input in our relationship with India. It's more trade and investment. And that raises a broader issue, which is, given the fact that most of the flows of resources in the globe are not bilateral government development assistance, government-to-government development assistance, most of the flow of resources are direct foreign investment, capital transfers, remittances, private sector humanitarian assistance. All of those things coupled, packed together, dwarf the size, volume, and frankly, impact of American bilateral government-to-government development assistance. It can be tactically important in some countries. It may be instrumental in other countries. It may contribute in other countries. But what I'm arguing here, expecting some pushback, is that we may be overstating, in the context of another country, the significance of our bilateral government-to-government development assistance in terms of our overall relationship with that country. Other flows may be significantly more important.
I wasn't limiting to government assistance, but there are American-funded NGOs that are doing catalytic work in a place like Bihar, one of the poorest states in India, where they will demonstrate a new health intervention that has some huge impact. There's one example I recently saw on the ground where it was, the treatment of putting an antibiotic on the umbilical cord of a baby. And when they scaled this, it had something like a 30% mortality reduction. I mean, huge. The American NGO demonstrates that at scale and then takes it to the government of India, and the government of India then funds the scaling across the state or the country. But it's just that critical upfront American investment to demonstrate the transformative practice is absolutely key. It's tiny dollars, but it is critical in terms of actually having impact.
Critical path.
Right.
You know,
Great.
I think, too, I agree with what you said at the end of your question, which is who steps in, and China is an obvious answer. It's certainly the announcement today on climate change. That's a logical thing that's going to happen, is the Chinese are going to use it as an opportunity to step further into the global stage. But I think in some ways what I worry about more is that what fills the vacuum is nothing, and that it's a vacuum. And I'm a patriot. I think we're a great country, and we have a lot to offer. And if we're not offering it, and there's nothing there, and there's an erosion in a global movement towards a better society, that vacuum that doesn't get filled worries me. And it worries me that we've had a foreign power that seems to be their goal, that's been undermining our country, and we're just letting it happen. I mean, obviously not the people here, not the people on stage. So I'm worried more than someone stepping into it, that no one steps into it.
Sarah, did you want to add?
Just to say, this is an expensive exercise. We've been through this before. We've never been through a proposed administration 28%, 30% cut. But we have been through an exercise where we've closed many missions and then had to revisit it and open them again. I mean, ultimately, that costs more money, right? So I think that I have faith in the Senate appropriators that they're not going to, this is an open gambit, right? So the administration gives its request. I think there's a lot of antipathy on the Hill, and I think USGLC has done an amazing job generating not the usual suspects to come out and speak about the importance of these budgets, and it just needs to keep happening, and it needs to be beyond USGLC, and it needs to be editorial boards of newspapers and mayors and governors and schools. People need to understand why this is a part of who we are and why cutting it is a threat.
Thank you. Mark.
Hi, thank you to the panel. Very intriguing topic. Mark Johnson with Tetra Tech. Can the panel comment on where the 3Ds have, an example where the 3Ds have worked together and why it worked well and what we can learn from it and take forward as we talk about an integrated strategy for the 3Ds? Thanks.
So I'm going to use my moderator perspective here and ask for quick answers, and not necessarily from everyone, because there's a sea of hands in the audience, okay? So we'll keep it quick. Who wants to answer?
Kenya election violence, preventing reoccurrence of election violence in 2013. We've had panels at USIP where a bunch of us came together and reflected on it. I don't know what was in the secret sauce, but there was something about it where 2010, 2011, 2012, there just was a very focused common goal that was shared by AID, by different parts of AID, by the embassy, by the desk at State, our defense colleagues, and we just were on a steady rhythm of coming together and trying to think through everything, and of course, partners on the ground. I mean, people wanted up and down all around Kenya to make sure that there wasn't a reoccurrence of the 07-08 violence.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes. Mariana.
Thank you. I'm Mariana Silva from Nathan Associates. Thank you very much for the discussion. It has been super interesting. You briefly mentioned about how the administration is thinking about pulling out from the Paris Agreement because they clearly don't see the business case or the leadership that the U.S. can take on this role. However, one topic that seems to be in fashion in the current budget discussion is infrastructure. And for security reasons, how can we make the infrastructure planning and development fit for purpose? meaning fit for all the risks that are rising due to weather patterns and climate change, and as well as cybersecurity attacks, everything that the global world is experiencing, and how can we make our infrastructure domestically more resilient?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right, is that this administration has taken, what I would consider an irresponsible position on climate change, but we can work on two levels here. We can call that for what it is and say that that position is wrong, it's morally wrong, it's not in our interest, it's economically wrong, all those things, and then also work with them. Because the investments in infrastructure are win-win. If you're going to make your infrastructure resilient to climate change, it's also an economic development improvement. It's a public safety improvement. So there's no reason not to do it. If we have to use different language to get them to put the money in the right places, so what? As long as we keep both tracks going at the same time. I don't think that any of us should give up talking about what we know is right and in our interests, but we can also be practical about it and help identify the investments that need to be made. So I think you're right that we got to do both.
Thank you. Let's see, the woman in the blue sweater.
Hi, I'm Allison Marinuk from Deloitte Consulting. Thank you very much for being here today. My question stems from something you touched on earlier about the importance of making the case for foreign aid to Americans. Earlier today, there was a panel titled, "What's in it for us?" And one of the takeaways was there are some minds that will just never change. And it's like that with all political issues. However, there are some hearts and minds that can be won. My question is, what would be your 30-second elevator pitch to Joe Smith in Ohio, who's skeptical of our foreign aid, but whose mind could be changed? It's for each of the panelists.
I'm just going to tell one little anecdote, and then I'll let you answer. So a friend of mine did this on the Hill, and it was very interesting. He went up to someone who he knew was a skeptic, and he said, do you think we're spending too much on foreign aid? Absolutely. How much do you think we're spending on foreign aid? 25% of our foreign budget, 25% on the dollar. Well, how much do you think would be appropriate? Maybe something under a nickel. And so he said, what if I told you we spend less than a penny on the dollar? Are you now willing to support what we do? So I think my point is that you have to start with correcting the factual baseline that most people assume we spend way more than we actually do. And when you say what would be reasonable, what we actually spend is usually within that band. So I would start with education on what the facts of the spending are.
I absolutely agree. Strategic communications is important, but I think also in that panel, they were talking about if you break it down and you say, it turns out that there are upwards of 20 million people living in conditions of slavery today. Some in the US, but many around the world. And our assistance dollars can help end buying and selling of humans for exploitation. Do you think that's a good thing? Or the health example that you gave, saving lives at birth, extending the life of, wouldn't you want to see the life of a mother and a baby extended beyond 24 hours? Or just even doing a better job of saying, this has been a long arc. We have 50 plus years of experience where our largest trade partners were once recipients of assistance and understanding it in that way. It's very hard in the strategic communications of this. You got to figure out what is the soft point. What are they interested in? Are you talking to somebody who would really be moved by a story about slavery? Is it somebody who's really focused on health? Is it somebody who's got children themselves? I'm a big proponent of public opinion data. I think we just don't have enough in many places, and it should drive how we talk about this.
I think also, nobody wants to go to war. People in uniform don't want to go to war, right? And if you're investing if you make investments that prevent you from going to war, that's a much better investment than fighting one. And not only that, at the end of the day, what is war for? It's not the battle. It's not what you achieve in a battle. It's what you achieve afterwards. And I think you have to remind people that that's ultimately, when we get in a war, that's what it's for. It's for the peace that you get afterwards, so that the investment we make on the front end to stabilize, to drive prosperity, this is all in our interests. And it's kind of funny, the whole America First thing. I mean, I understand that there's a longer play in development that has more to say about human dignity, and that's a very important thing, a very important discipline, as Sarah said. But at the same time, when we're talking about taxpayer dollars and foreign aid and AID, that's about our own self-interests. It's about our prosperity, it's about our security, and investing in others for our own purposes. It was always America First. It's just we can't do it alone. And that we've always formed alliances and partnerships and trade relationships and made these investments for our own interests and to better our own country. So I mean, to me, I don't understand why we make the distinction in the first place. When we're talking about government programs and taxpayer dollars, it's always been about us. So.
I have a different view. No surprise, I guess. It's interesting. The last couple of years, I've been living up in the state of Maine. Full time, yeah, even in the winter. And what is really striking to me in an era like the last 6 months in particular, where Washington has intruded on the lives of local people just sort of via television and social media and all the ways that it intrudes in a way that most people were just blissfully unaware in the last 6 months. I've gotten relatively involved in some of that in the state of Maine. And what's really striking to me is that my learning curve on things like immigration policy and health policy and employment policy and investment policy and taxes and regulation, my learning curve on those things is absolutely vertical. There's no question about it, because that's what people care about.
Right.
They do not care about foreign assistance. Let me repeat that, they do not care about foreign assistance. Some personally, value-wise, morally, wonderful. They give to their churches, they participate in voluntary contributions, all that kind of thing. But it's not day-to-day the thing that really concerns them about what's going on in the world. Interestingly, they don't really care about defense either. They really don't care.
They don't like being in wars.
They don't like being in wars, but that's not the most salient thing to them right now. It really isn't. In the state of Maine, the biggest concern about the Department of Defense is, are they making enough ships at Bath Iron Works?
Yeah.
That's it. Because that's 5,000 jobs
Yes.
around the town of Bath, Maine. That's 8 miles from where I live. That matters.
Yep.
Okay? But they don't really care about the big arguments about readiness and too much on procurement and all the stuff that we spend all our time in Washington arguing about. Frankly, madam, they don't give a damn, right? So what's interesting to me is I think in terms of the budgetary politics of Function 150, because it doesn't have a big constituency in the country that cares, which is a huge contrast with defense, huge contrast politically with defense, which has a big nationwide constituency of employment and mayors and bases and all the infrastructure and veterans, and there's a huge lobbying capability here, and this we talk about in the book too, that the State Department and the USAID frankly just don't have, which makes the politics of this a peculiarly inside Washington discussion. Not much of a national discussion, but a peculiarly inside discussion. And there I think Michèle's example is illustrative. That it wasn't a discussion with somebody in Keokuk, Iowa. It was a discussion with a member of Congress who opposes this, right? The politics of this are in Washington, and as you all know better because it's your business more than mine, the politics of doing something about the Trump budget is going to be in Washington. It's not going to be a nationwide movement suddenly surging to the barricades on behalf of development.
I think that remains
It's going to be a
seen,
Washington
though.
game. Well,
There's
let me just
an
finish the
article
thought.
in the
Let me
Times
just finish the
today
thought.
about
Let me just finish
the
the thought. Can I
BMW
finish the
plan.
thought?
So you know what? Great wine conversation, okay? But let me keep, I'm sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt, but I'm going to, so let me
Good.
keep
Go
getting
ahead.
questions, okay?
Please.
Let's see. Sir.
All right, so, sir, I'm sure you're aware that it's no secret that the military, DoD, and developmental agencies often speak very different languages, not only in the words they use, a lot of acronyms, but also cultural and intended missions. So what is something that can be done to bridge this gap in communication in order to facilitate more cooperation as the DoD becomes kind of the more funded agency, but also can help to further the developmental agency missions?
Well, I think Michèle will probably want to weigh in on that one too. The linguistic problem is real. It's real in all agencies. And if I wandered into APA, I wouldn't have a foggiest notion of what they were talking about, right? And I was PAD at OMB for NSIA. Do you know what that is? No, right? I mean, every institution has a nomenclature, and the Defense Department needs a whole encyclopedia to carry its nomenclature. I think the one thing that helps with that, it's not a solution to the problem of strategic thinking that Michèle and I both talked about, is for people to do assignments in each other's agencies. That's how you learn it. You learn it in the culture. You go there, you're in a mission, you're in Stuttgart, you're somewhere, you're in the field, you're in Somalia, wherever you are, you will pick up each other's language as you go along, and that's useful.
Great.
I also think those exchanges are critical, and whether it's exchanges, education together, training together, it's beyond language. It's fundamentally different ways of looking at the world. Just if you consider the arc, I'm trying to figure out how this looks to you as the audience. So if you, the arc of time for a development assistance professional is a 20 to 30 year arc. I mean, development takes a really long time to take a part of a country out of poverty and really get it to a different place. May take longer than that, may take generations. The military is thinking about operational timelines. We're going in, we're going to have this phase for 6 months, then we may be there for a few years, and then we're trying to transition out. And they're trying to get results in that, operational timeline in a way that sometimes are unrealistic or sometimes are possible, and they may be very useful from a tactical military and security perspective, but they actually distort the overall development effort that's happening over time. So I think one of the things that you have to get at is a very different way of viewing the problems and bridging that. I would submit to you that there are subcultures within development assistance that are actually more aligned with the military operational perspective than they are with their own mother culture. Mm-hmm. So if you talk to OFTA, which are the foreign, the emergency folks who are on the plane within 24 hours going to a humanitarian disaster, you would recognize them immediately. They are expeditionary, deployable, go into the crisis, face anything kind of risk-taking professionals. Mm-hmm. They're very easily, that gap is very easily to bridge. Then you'd have OTI, Office of Transition. They have the more shorter term, how do we make change quickly? How do we make an impact that can help a larger operation? They are also culturally very easy to bridge the gap. But the gap between the military's operational focus and the classic development professional that is thinking on a totally different timeline, of which this little military operation is just a blip on that, that's a hard one to bridge.
Most people don't know that USAID is the integrator of U.S. humanitarian assistance.
Yes.
They're the integrator, not the Department of Defense. Right. The pictures, the package lifting, all that stuff that you see on the media and social media sites, all DoD providers. The reality is the integrator is USAID, and OFTA is best practice in terms of what USAID can do with a DART team and intervening rapidly in a situation. They're also extremely underfunded.
Great. I think a really hopeful thing now is that we're able to collect data and do analytics that we've never been able to do before with some of the new computer and IT tools that we have. And I think there's a lot of possibility in there to create a common language for diagnosing long-term challenges and strategies to address them. So I'm very optimistic. I think Mercy Corps is a place that's worth looking at. that's been developing the analytics and the understanding and tying it to their actions. And I think that that is going to be a very familiar, comfortable fit for defense operators. So I'm optimistic that those kinds of tools give us a way to build new communications skills and get in each other's worlds.
Great, thank you. So let's see, one last question we'll go to over here, and then I'm going to wrap up.
Hi, I'm Nora O'Connell with Save the Children, and thank you all for being here today. We opened the day actually hearing from a panel of former USAID administrators. And Peter McPherson, who is aid administrator under President Reagan, talked about how Reagan came in saying he was going to slash foreign aid. And as things heated up in Central America, he reversed his position. And he talked about it as the penny dropped. Right. So the question is, do you think the penny will drop with this administration? And if so, what do you think will trigger that? Thanks.
Suppose we made this binary, yes or no. You had to vote on that.
Which penny?
I mean, I think the climate change decision today, if you take that as a harbinger, no, because I think the penny did drop. I think he heard from a lot of people he cared about, you know, from his daughter to Elon Musk, that they needed to Tillerson, you know, and Mattis, that you need to stay in this agreement. And I think he probably got it. But he made a promise, and he was speaking to his base, and this was about domestic politics, and he did it anyway. So I'm not sure the penny will drop.
Every Republican president has upped the development budget in the end.
Has what?
Has upped the development budget. And let's recall that under President Reagan, he launched essentially democracy assistance. But I don't consider President Trump a Republican.
I don't either.
My answer is one word, no.
Indeed.
I don't think the penny will drop because not at that level, because we're not dealing with somebody, in my judgment, who thinks policy. It's not who he is. The penny will not drop. And that's why I started out by saying at the beginning of this is not normal. We are not living in a normal presidency. The penny does not drop that way.
I think I agree. I think it's very unlikely that he'll change his fundamental position. I think it's up to the Congress who ultimately has the power of the purse to make it right.
So we started by quoting Secretary of Defense Mattis, and there's one other statement that he made, and I think, Michèle, you quoted it in one of your recent op-eds, right? He basically said that the U.S. has two fundamental powers, one of intimidation and one of inspiration. And hopefully we will maintain both of those going forward. Before I thank the panel and end things, let me just ask you, and we're going to go in reverse order here. So Sarah, I'm going to ask you to start. One takeaway action that people in this room should do in light of the issue of potential cuts, changes to policy, and the like. What is that one quick takeaway that you would like to leave with people?
For those of you who have representatives, you need to call them, and you need to make sure your families are calling them, and your hometown, wherever you come from. I think we do need to activate beyond just the Hill and beyond the Washington elite.
Sharon.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I was talking to a satellite office of a federal agency, and they were remarkably not as worried as I thought they would be. And they said it's because their congressional delegation told them this isn't going to happen. We'll see, but I think that's true. I also think that, I think for all of us, the tendency to focus on what you're doing, especially the kind of work that you all engage in, is hard work. To focus on it and do the work and not tell the story here at home. That's we got to get past that, and we've got to figure out how to explain, per your question, why this matters to Americans, why it should matter, not just as a moral good, but as something that's in their interest. We all are going to have to do more to articulate that and to talk to Americans about why this matters in a way that's going to make sense to them. I don't think we've been doing as well at that. And I put myself as a former political appointee in that category too. we haven't been doing as well as we need to. We thought it was self-evident, and we thought people got it, and what we found in the last election was they didn't. So we got to do a better job.
Gordon.
Because I think the dollars will go down, it won't go down 28%, but because I think they will go down, I don't disagree with what's been said, but I would say my recommendation would be set priorities and have a plan B operationally. Know what's important to you, what you want to draw your wagon in a circle around, draw your wagon in a circle around it, defend it, and have a plan B if you're in the sector that's going in and out of the government and dealing with this area of contracting. Have a plan B. Know what you will do if the budget goes down 10%, 15%, 20%, 25%.
Great. Thank you. Michèle.
I would just refine the message on calling your congressman. I would call appropriators and authorizers on the relevant committees, because at the end of the day, they're going to ask for a tally. Who's for, who's against. And also support groups that are doing this work. There's a lot of advocacy going on, some very effective coalitions across the NGO community. That one example of which is they got in the 17 budget appropriations $1 billion for humanitarian assistance that wasn't requested. That's a pretty big win, and it shows the power of that advocacy when people unite together. And so it can be done. And now is the time. And if I'd say not only you make those calls, but you each find 10 people to make calls, this really has to be experienced on the Hill as a firestorm of pushback on what this administration has proposed.
Thank you. And Sid and the audience and I can't thank you for your time and effort here, sharing your experience and your service. Please join me in thanking.
Okay, we are just a few seconds away from wine. So before we end today, I want to take a moment to thank everybody who has made today possible. It's been a very good day. Our 47 sponsors, as well as all of you, the guests, for attending. I also want to take a moment to thank the planning committee we had for this, which was Ed Abel, Ann Simmons-Benton, Ann Haddock, Sue, Demetria Arventitis, and Kate Thompson. These are members of our board of directors who have worked for hours and weeks in making today possible. I also want to take a moment to thank Catherine Rafelson, the SID staff, and the volunteers who worked all during the weekend, the holiday weekend, for this. So thank you all very, very much for doing it. You have made it possible. So we hope you'll leave this conference today with a lot to think about and continue the discussions over the next weeks and months to come. The discussions have not ended as of today. So thank you all very much, and we will see you next door for the wine. Okay?